Alright everybody, hello, welcome again. We've got a little bit of a different video for you today. I'm going to be doing a review of Elden Ring, and I know it's a little late, but if you've seen any of my minute-long game review showcases, you'll know that a minute just isn't enough time to do these games justice. But really, these long-form reviews are kind of a way for me to talk about concepts in video games or game design that I really love, and I think Elden Ring is a great start. So what do I mean when I say the structure of a game? Because I think that's such a broad concept that it could literally mean anything you wanted it to. But for me, I think of the structure as literally just the most basic thing you possibly can. The structure is how you design a game from start to finish. And I think when you talk about From Software specifically, you're talking about a game that is gameplay centric and story second. So when I say that story is second in Elden Ring, it may sound like a dig or an insult, but I think that's really just how the game is designed. And it all kind of boils down to this very From Software concept of hands-off storytelling. You know, when we talk about God of War or Horizon Forbidden West, you're talking about Kratos and Aloy. Actual characters with emotions and personalities and relationships. And as you go through the game, you build more and more relationships with all of these crazy characters. But Elden Ring doesn't have that. You may talk to a few characters and you may go through a few quests, but in the end, you're almost like a witness to the story. You're almost like a witness to the world that's around you. But really, I think it's more like you're kind of a force of nature. You're an agent of change. And so as you go through the world, what are you doing? You're basically just killing everyone. And the only real interaction that you have with another character, at least the only interaction that I really cared about, was at the very end when you see Godfrey. And he looks at you and he says, "You're a tarnished, but you are worthy of being a lord." And sometimes you don't need a lot of dialogue. You just need awesome lines like that. So if you want to understand the structure of Elden Ring, what you're really talking about is map design and stats. You know, the game, when you look back on it, the map is basically broken up into a 3-act structure. The first act is Limgrave, and it ends with Radahn. You know, you have to go to Altus to unlock that fight. The second act ends when you fight Morgott, and you think that the game is over. But then suddenly there's this whole nother area full of demigods and insanely high-level enemies. And that's where the stats come into play. I'm sure when you guys fought Melania, you started to realize that you need to be a pretty high level to beat this game. I honestly say like over 100 is kind of mandatory. Because when you look at, let's say, the difference between 40 and 60 in terms of health or even dexterity, you're going to get a big bump in stats, which is pretty unique when you look at past games like Dark Souls 3. And it's kind of necessary, because by the time you get to the end of the game, every enemy is giving you insane amounts of money, but they're also obliterating you just as fast. So you can't really talk about the structure of a From Software game without talking about enemy design. And I think Elden Ring really nails it this time around. You know, when we talk about, even in Limgrave, you're already starting to see the patterns. You know, we always start out with foot soldiers, by far the weakest trash tier mobs. And then somewhere in the middle, you have regular soldiers. And then finally, you have knights, which are definitely the bigger threat. And you can kind of apply this to any area in the game and it'll make sense. You know, let's say you go to an Eternal City. The little blob dudes, those are the trash mobs. And then somewhere in the middle, you have the silver tiers with weapons. And then finally at the top, at least in my opinion, you have the priestesses and the enemies that use the flowing weapons. Now, I also want to talk about the bosses, and more specifically the world bosses. You know, I like to use the Deathbirds as an example, because it's pretty basic. You know, you have a weak Deathbird, and then later on in the game, you'll meet Deathrite birds, which are just a harder variant with more abilities, but fundamentally it's the same boss, similar patterns, so they don't have to design a whole new boss. So iteration isn't just something that happens within a studio. It obviously also happens within the industry as a whole and within specific genres. But I just think that From Software has always been ahead of the curve for at least a decade when it comes to iterating on past ideas and coming up with new concepts for other companies to iterate on. So I think for a lot of us, Elden Ring felt familiar and fresh at the same time because they basically took every concept from Dark Souls and a little bit from Bloodborne and just ported it into the game. But this time around, each of those concepts has its own world and characters and lore, all based around that specific idea. And then I'm not even talking about the status effects, which arguably have even more lore. I mean, you're talking about the god of rot. You're talking about the formless mother and Moog. You're talking about Fortisax and Wormface and Godwyn. I mean, it's just endless. And each of those concepts has a ton of characters and lore based around that idea. Now, I'm sure that everyone has been waiting for me to finally talk about this iteration, and it's honestly one of the biggest changes that From Software has ever made. That's right, I'm talking about jumping. And I'm sure some of you are like, wow, that's the dumbest thing he's ever said. But From Software purists will tell you that adding a jump mechanic, adding vertical traversal, literally forces every single map to be designed differently. And I think the best example of this is Stormvale Castle, which is almost like a playground for From Software to practice their jumping mechanics and for them to practice designing a world around the ability to jump. I think that also for a lot of us, adding the horse, which has a double jump and even has these spirit springs, creates a ton of ability to create verticality within the maps. And when we talk about open worlds, verticality is the secret. You know, not being able to get up a cliff face is a big reason why you can't get to an area. And so part of the game becomes searching around and looking for ways to ascend and descend different levels, which are almost creating these different structures within the map. And finally, I think one of my favorite features and iterations that's a little bit harder to define is just the fact that with Elden Ring, From Software has basically fleshed out every weapon class in the game. And also with the addition of dual wielding, it's almost like the game is telling you that you should be using more weapons. Part of what I love is that it feels like each boss is kind of designed to have a certain weakness. You know, certain enemies that are made of stone, or maybe the death birds, are going to be weak to strike and standard damage. And then you run into armored knights and stone dragons, and those enemies are going to be weak to pierce damage. So you can start to see that the game is designed in such a way that they want you to pick a standard weapon, a slash weapon, a pierce weapon, and a strike weapon. Honestly, strike you don't really need, but you get the idea. You know, heavy thrusting swords is a new weapon class. Great spears is a new weapon class. And the whole point is that there's always something for you to use, and there's always a new weapon for you to try out and see why it's good in specific situations. Of course, I have to mention the community. Obviously, I'm a little biased, but I think that the From Software games have some of the best communities out there. If you know me, you know I got my start making Elden Ring tutorials on TikTok. I also want to give a shout out to the Coop, who also got his start on TikTok, and now he streams 5 days a week streaming Elden Ring. So go give him a follow. I also want to shout out the OG PvPers, you know, Prod and Lost and Chase. They always hold it down. They're always putting out good content. And I haven't even mentioned the modding scene. You know, these mods will literally completely change the game on a fundamental level. If you're talking about randomizers, you're talking about turning the game into basically a roguelike. And then there's also these content mods that are these massive files, and they completely change the game. You know, new movesets, more armor. Sometimes they even redesign the maps. And it's like a completely new game, and you can get it for free on the Nexus. All right, everybody, thanks for watching. Make sure to like and subscribe, and definitely leave a comment. If I said anything that resonated with you, if you want to share something you love about Elden Ring, or if you want to just tell me I'm wrong, make sure to drop it in the comments down below.